Moral panic rarely stays confined to headlines. Eventually, societies start acting on fear. Schools change policies. Governments pass laws. Institutions create restrictions. And suddenly, fear stops being cultural. It becomes structural. Because once people emotionally accept a threat, they often begin demanding protection. And throughout history, that pattern repeats constantly. A group becomes framed as dangerous. Public anxiety rises. Media amplifies the fear. And eventually, institutions step in claiming they must restore safety. Not always through openly hateful language, often through the language of protection. Because control rarely introduces itself as control, it usually introduces itself as safety. Once fear becomes widespread enough, doing nothing starts feeling irresponsible. Because people demand answers, protection, intervention, and action. Because panic creates emotional urgency, and emotional urgency pressures institutions to respond quickly, especially when children, morality, or public safety become attached to the conversation. At that point, hesitation itself can start looking suspicious, and neutrality can look dangerous. Because once a society emotionally internalizes a threat, people often stop asking whether the threat is being understood accurately and start asking why institutions are not moving faster. History shows this repeatedly. Fear creates pressure. Pressure creates policy. And once policy enters the conversation, panic stops being just cultural. It becomes institutional. And policy often expands far beyond the original emotional reaction that created it. One of the most important things to understand about institutional fear is how it presents itself. Restrictions are rarely introduced using openly hostile language. They are usually framed as reasonable, protective, necessary, protecting children, public safety, community standards, protecting women, common sense restrictions. And because the language sounds protective, many people emotionally accept the policies before carefully examining how they function in practice. Because control is rarely introduced as control, it is usually introduced as protection. And throughout history, many policies now viewed negatively were originally defended using the language of safety, morality, or preserving society. Not because every concern was fake, but because fear changes how societies define what feels reasonable, especially during periods of uncertainty and rapid cultural change. This is where moral panic becomes especially powerful, because institutions often present restrictions as neutral, equal, universal. But rules that sound neutral can still affect groups very differently in practice. Because language and impact are not the same thing, especially when the rules are created around fears tied to specific identities. And history shows this repeatedly as well. Access becomes restricted, visibility becomes regulated, participation becomes debated. Certain groups suddenly face disproportionate scrutiny in public spaces. Not always because institutions openly announce hostility, but because panic slowly reshapes what society considers risky, or inappropriate, or threatening. And once that happens, even ordinary participation can start becoming framed as controversy. Because fear changes perception first, and institutions often codify those perceptions afterwards. Moral panic rarely stays limited to its original justification, because once fear becomes institutionalized, the definition of danger often expands with it. A conversation that starts in one area suddenly spreads into others, and panic rarely stays where it starts. Visibility becomes regulation. Regulation becomes restriction. Restriction becomes exclusion. Because once institutions begin responding to fear, the definition of danger often expands. And over time, the original justification can start becoming less important than the emotional atmosphere surrounding the issue itself. Because panic creates momentum. Institutions respond to pressure. Media responds to outrage. Politicians respond to fear. And eventually, entire systems can begin organizing themselves around managing a perceived threat, even when the public understanding of that threat remains deeply simplified. One of the most difficult parts of studying moral panic is recognizing that most people involved rarely see themselves as villains. Most institutional fear responses feel justified at the time. They feel responsible, necessary, and protective. And that is what makes moral panic so difficult to recognize. Because panic rarely feels irrational while people are living through it. People usually believe they are protecting something important, like society, stability, children, morality. And fear makes certainty feel emotionally urgent, especially when reinforced through politics, media, and public conversation. Which is why societies so often struggle to recognize panic while it is actively happening. Fear is human. Fear happens. The danger is not fear itself. The danger is what fear makes societies willing to justify. Because once fear changes perception, institutions start changing too. Restrictions begin feeling responsible. Control begins feeling protective. Exclusion begins feeling reasonable. And that is why understanding moral panic matters. Not because it explains one issue, but because it explains a pattern. A pattern that history repeats far more often than people realize. God be well, and I'll see you in the next one.